and welcome to the Vocal Prize Podcast, a podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I'm Megan Figueroa. And I'm upright and happy to be doing an intro.
Yeah.
I've been so sick. It's like my immune system wasn't ready because I've been like, it's usually I'm like touching dirty things all the time out in the world, but.
And breathing in lots of air.
Yeah, breathing in lots of air. From my fellow disgusting human beings. So I might be a little bit hoarse still.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah, you're a little hoarse, but you're not that bad, actually. I was expecting you to be worse.
Yeah.
Anyway, you were going to tell me something.
I was.
I know. Surnames. Okay.
Yes, this is really cool. So I feel like sometimes I'm mad at The Atlantic, and then sometimes they do good things.
Yeah, they're very mixed.
It's so mixed. Last week on the 27th of October, they posted an article called A Patriarchal Tradition That Just Won't Budge. Straight married couples in the U.S. still almost always give kids the father's last name. Why? And they interview Dr. Christine Mallinson, who's fantastic. She talks about how their two children, her and her husband's two children, actually have her last name. And they talked about this and they decided that they would do this. And so it's just about why do we still see so many people just automatically giving children the father's name. And at one point she says that she thinks it's just something that's kind of automatic and people don't actually have this conversation. And just like, don't even stop to really reflect or think about it. And actually that would have been my guess too, is that a lot of people are just like, well, that's just how you do it. Why disrupt that? Because I know there are so many issues when it comes to legal things.
And also, it's still the case that most women are taking their husband's last name.
Yes, exactly. 2002, there's this research paper, but they found that 97% of married couples pass down the father's name. So, like, this is just almost like a given that this is going to happen.
Well, I'm wondering how many of the women have taken their husband's last names, because of course they're going to pass on the father's last name. What's interesting is where they don't change their name. Right.
So in 1975, only 3% of women kept their last name. So, of course, that's grown.
But I think it's no more than 20% now.
It's literally about 20%. Yep.
Yes.
Yep. In 1975, when it was 3%, there were still laws in the books where, like, women couldn't get shit done, like credit cards or whatever, unless they had their husband's surname. So, again, like, all these legal issues that are, like, restricting women's choices.
Mm-hmm.
Tail is all the time. So, even within this 20% of women who keep their last names, it's still, like, the majority will pass down the father's last name. And then I'm just thinking about this, like, cross-culturally. So, like, my dad, his middle name is his mom's last name. And this is very traditional. So sometimes it's hyphenated, but his is just, it's not hyphenated and it appears to be his middle name. And then, of course, his dad's last name is, the last name that he has. And so I think that I don't know if this is just like a Spanish-speaking world type of thing, but I'm sure there are other kinds of traditions of having last names, both last names included.
As far as I know, most of the Spanish-speaking world, there's two last names. One's from the mother, one's from the father, but the father one is the latter one.
Is the last one. So
it's the most important one. In Quebec, women tend not to take their husband's last name. This has been true for decades. You have to go out of your way you have to go out of your way to change it anyway, but there's it's just not an expected thing. But I don't know what they do with the children's last names.
Yeah.
It's probably still the case that it's the husband's name most of the time. And then in wealthier families in the UK, there's a tradition of keeping both names, hyphenating the names, because this often happens when the woman's family is richer or more powerful. So you want the children to be like, oh, you're part of that family. And so you have to have them hyphenated.
Ah, interesting.
And then there's lots of cultures that don't have last names at all. But.
Of course, yes. Or like place names, right? Like, or where you're from, or the village will be what your last name is. Like,
That could be the case, but there's some that don't have any last names at all.
At all, it wouldn't be. Okay. So talking about hyphenated, this article talks to a woman named Alicia Hernandez Grande, who, when she wanted to get her driver's license as a teenager back in 2004, the DMV tried to split her last name because she does not have a hyphen between Hernandez and Grande, but she wanted Hernandez and Grande as her last name, even though there was no hyphen. This is such a problem that New York actually passed a law in 2019 that allows people to choose to have two last names separated by a space on legal documents like that. So, like, that's something I've never thought of. It makes me kind of wonder sometimes, like, for example, people like my dad, if he would have wanted to have, like, Chacon Figueroa as, you know, the whole thing, like, those choices that he can't really make because the law prevents it, and how that would change things for people.
Right. And I know that the opposite has happened in at least some Spanish-speaking countries. Like, one of my friends was in some Spanish-speaking country, I don't even remember where, and they thought his middle name was his first last name. And so they were, like, constantly looking for him under John, you know, because they was expecting two last names. Anyway, yep. It's interesting. Like, how important culture is to these kinds of decisions, and, like, you just can't imagine not having a second last name, or you can't imagine having more than one last name, or etc.
So, very cool article. I thought it was really cool that Dr. Mallinson shared that, because I'll be happy to see more people that name their kids with the mother's surname.
Yeah, when I was younger and I was still on the fence about whether I was going to have kids or not, I was like, if I have a daughter, my last name. Son, his last name.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I'm like, my last name, because, I mean, okay, I guess going back to, like, where I'm from or who I am is, like, Figueroa is something that I want to be able to pass on because, like, you know, my partner's a white dude. You know, come on. What is his last name going to do? But yeah, no, it's really cool. And I want to see more articles like this in the Atlantic and other places. Just more talking about language and
less talking about cancel culture. And
yes.
Anyway, this episode we talk all about memes and collecting data from friends and all kinds of
interesting stuff. And it's another interview about a book, which I'm really enjoying these days.
Yes, we're always happy to interview people about their books.
Yes, we love books. Anyway, we hope you enjoy.
Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
So today we have Dr. Sylvia Sierra, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University. She's a discourse analyst interested in language and social interaction, who takes an interactional sociolinguistic approach to exploring knowledge management and identity construction in everyday communication in both face-to-face and online context. Her research interests include identity, epistemics, intertextuality, globalization, popular culture/media, Mexican Spanish, social media, multimodal methods/embodied interaction, and discourse level sociolinguistic variation. And the reason why we're having her on today is because her new book is about to come out on November 9th, Millennials Talking Media, Creating Intertextual Identities in Everyday Conversation. So welcome, Sylvia.
Yeah, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on here. I'm so happy to get to nerd out about my book with you guys.
Yeah. And I love talking about millennials because, you know, what do millennials love most is talking about themselves and destroying things,
Totally.
right? Just ruining all the market.
Yes.
Well, you find
Killing
you find
everything.
only one, everything's broken.
Yeah. Yes.
We were just talking before we started recording that all the supply chains are broken, and so the book might be not coming out on November 9th, so we're fingers crossed November 9th.
Yes.
Finger crossed. Millennials killed the global supply chain.
And only millennials, nobody else. Okay, so why did you want to write this book?
Well, it helps in my department to write a book when you're in a tenure track position. It's kind of helpful to write a book. But really, you know, when I was writing my dissertation, I had several mentors who had turned their dissertations into books. So it seemed like a reasonable goal. And I kind of used theirs as models when I was writing my dissertation. So like I used Cynthia Gordon's book and her dissertation as a model. So even as I was writing the dissertation, I was thinking about it like a book. And I thought it would have kind of a broader appeal than a lot of academic books. And actually, you know, it wasn't even about millennials to start with. It was really just about quoting media and everyday talk. And it was later on when I realized, you know what, everyone I recorded for this book, they're millennials. And it seemed like that actually was kind of a key piece of the media they were quoting. So I decided to kind of go with that when I revised it for the book. And, you know, there's been academic articles and a couple edited volumes and dissertations on media references, but there's no real book about how and why we reference media in our everyday conversation. So I really wanted to show kind of the why and how people do this. So the why is like, you know, how do we, in face-to-face spoken conversation, which is what I analyze, how do we phonetically signal media references? How are we able to hear when someone's making one and kind of get it? So that's a piece of the why, or sorry, the how. And then also, how do we show that we got it? Like, do we laugh? Do we repeat it? Do we engage with it somehow? So, and then kind of like the bigger piece of it is, why do we do it? How do these function? And what I found is they seem to happen at these really interesting, awkward moments in conversation, oftentimes when not all people share the same access to participate in the conversation. And someone will use a media reference to kind of smooth over that awkwardness and get everyone back on the same page and get everyone to laugh. So, for example, in the book, it starts out actually with a really awkward and horrible camping trip I went on with some of my friends. And in one of the examples, we're talking about this, and one of the other friends wasn't there, but he becomes involved in talking about this trip that involved like a head injury and vomiting in a tent and all kinds of crazy stuff. And he says, sounds like a bad Oregon Trail trip. So he connects it to this video game, and that's how he gets involved. And everyone laughs, and he's able to become part of this experience. And so I found that they often function to like fill these awkward spaces and ultimately kind of bond people together through their shared media knowledge. So that's kind of why I wanted to write the book in a way, was just to show really like why we use these so much.
Carrie, is Oregon Trail a reference that you get?
Yes,
like,
of course. I'm not 50 million years old.
But like, did you play the game?
Yes, of course.
In Canada? I don't know what Canadians do.
Oh,
I don't know how you're raised.
Yes. So most media crosses the border. So video games definitely cross the border, and yeah, we played that game for sure. So there's the Oregon Trail generation is supposed to like be like the youngest Gen X and the oldest millennials, and technically I'm still too old to be in that category according to the numbers that they have. And it's weird because I definitely grew up.
Those numbers are all
made up. Yeah. So here's another way it's made up. So when I was still a teenager, I was technically Gen Y. And then that got shifted to much later and got recategorized as millennial. So I've always been in this liminal space. I can't believe I'm actually using that word. I've never used that before. So yeah, anyway, yes, I do know Oregon Trail and I did play it.
Yeah, it was, in my research, I found it was like popular across all of North America, like in the, I guess, early 90s. But yeah, generations as a concept, a lot of it is baloney, but it's kind of a convenient concept for my book, and people like talking about millennials, so.
Yeah, I mean, we need some way of sort of like carving out space so that we can talk about things, but it is still, we should all remember it is still made up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
It might be a little like, even, North America or Western centric. Like people from like China tell me that they think about these things differently, or they use, different terms and stuff. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, we need to talk to someone about that. That would be so fun.
Yeah.
Generations.
It would be really cool. Yeah.
Okay. So what are intertextual identities and how do we create them?
Good question. I think I made up that concept. Just making up things here left and right. No, I think because I wanted the intertextual piece and identities in the title. So intertextuality is, you can kind of simplify that to mean repetition of shared prior texts. It can just be any kind of repetition of anything, really. It can be considered intertextuality. And so in talking about media, intertextual identities in this sense are the kind of identities we create for ourselves when we reference prior texts. So like, referencing the Oregon Trail, that might index that you're part of the Oregon Trail generation, that you're someone who played that game. When I look at conversations among my graduate students, they tend to quote or talk about a lot of like books and poetry and stuff, right? And that's kind of creating this intertextual like graduate student identity. If I compare that with my undergraduates, they're talking a lot about like sports and celebrities and things. And that's, another kind of identity that kind of speaks to the stage of life that they're in right now and what they find interesting.
And text is very broadly defined.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Because, when we think of text, we might think of something written. But it can be, a song, right? With lyrics or without, just the tune. Like you can sing, you can hum a tune to a song, right? And that's still intertextual. Or you can maybe put new words to the tune of a song, and that could be intertextual. And accents and dialects, can be intertextual. So yeah, it can be beyond just like a written text for sure. So
here's an example that has come up, and you can tell me if this counts. So there's a Gregorian like funeral chant, and Iras, I think, and it has the introductory 4 notes is used over and over again, and including in Squid Game. And I found this out from TikTok.
Yes, I saw that TikTok. See, we're doing it right now. Intertextual TikTok identities.
Oh boy.
Wait, so individual TikToks could be a text.
Yeah, I've, since I've started using TikTok, I find myself referring to things I've seen on there in conversation and using that, as a kind of intertextual reference point. And the point that you just brought up about just those like 4 notes from that Gregorian chant being repeated in all kinds of films and now in Squid Game to sort of create this ambiance of like death and dread. Yeah, that's a great example of intertextual text that isn't really what we might think of as a text. Yeah.
So I found your book really interesting. And at the beginning, you set up like how you did this. And I was just like, I actually got a knot in the pit of my stomach because I was like, oh my God, you are using data from your friends.
Yeah.
How complicated and difficult that must be. So I guess just talk about that. Like, why did you decide to use that type of data, and like, was it difficult?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting like journey with that. So in kind of my subfield of interactional sociolinguistics, it's really common to draw on conversational data from your friends and family. And part of the reason for that is because in interactional sociolinguistics, we're kind of obsessed with context and knowing a lot about the people involved in the setting and the prior relationships. So in that sense, it's helpful to record like your friends or your family, because as an analyst, you know a lot about those people and their relationships and everything. So it's really common in my field. It's not, uncommon. And then besides that, in grad school, I didn't really have like a community I was interested in. It felt like a lot of people in my program and kind of like a year ahead of me, they were interested in like looking at like law students or, I don't know, math students or some kind of, beauty parlor salon talk or like some kind of community. And I didn't really have that. I had these more theoretical interests in issues of identity and knowledge. And so it was actually linguist Deborah Tannen, who was at Georgetown and still is when I was there. She encouraged me to just start recording conversations I was a part of. And she had actually done that. A lot of people don't realize for her classic Thanksgiving dinner conversation that she analyzed in her first book, Conversational Style, that was just one of many conversations she recorded for her dissertation. And she ended up just using that one conversation. So it turned out to be great advice. I just started recording stuff among my friends and, conversations I was in with people. And eventually I got this interest in looking at these media references, and it started with video games and then it kind of grew from there. And, it was really fun starting out with my friends. They were very like willing to participate in this. They liked it. We had a lot of fun, and it only got difficult later when I started looking at issues like stereotypes and ideologies that are embedded in this media that we then repeat when we quote it, with oftentimes without having really any idea what's going on there. And that is when things started getting a little ethically difficult, was when I started looking at things like racism and sexism in these conversations. So that piece came a little later, and it definitely complicated things.
Yeah, that's exactly why. Because I read it out of order. So I read the chapter 4, which is the one you wanted us to talk about most. And then I went back to chapter 1. And I think that's why I was like, oh,
yeah.
Because your friends, like you had these conversations with your friends too about like, okay, so
yeah,
that was kind of racist. So what are we going to do about it?
Right. Yeah. We did those playback interviews where I would play back these things they had said. And so, what do you think's going on here? And, what is this referencing? And they would say things like, oh, that's an Indian trope. And it's like, let's unpack that. Where'd you get that from? But in the end, in a way, it was good because we got to have those critical discussions. And I think it probably opened a lot of our eyes to things we just weren't even thinking about before.
So you think in the middle of those conversations, when you were recording them, no one was as thoughtful as they were later. So these came later, these thoughts. Okay.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a spectrum. Some of these stereotypes are really embedded and insidious, and I think it would really take an analyst to pick them apart. Some of them are more obvious. And so, like, there's some cases where I think people might have had a sense when they were making the reference that it was somehow problematic, but there's some theorizing around this, how, like, when we make jokes or for humor, we kind of set aside our critical sensitivity. And we're willing to make these jokes for laughs, especially if we're in, for example, like an all-white space, which a lot of the spaces I recorded were. So in some of those cases, people might have had a sense what they were doing was not so great. And then in other cases, I think it was totally like they weren't even aware, really. So it varied. But yeah, in any case, the like critical reflections didn't come up until later when I kind of prompted them.
So this happened to me last night, and I wonder if this is an example of it, of how, like, in the moment you could perhaps are not as thoughtful of it because of just how powerful stereotyping is. But someone told me about an Irish soccer player who destroyed his liver by drinking. And I, like, almost made a joke about the Irish and drinking. Like, I mean, I did, didn't really almost, but like that's what came to my mind in my head. Yeah. So I wonder if it's kind of like that playing out.
Yeah, I mean, we're like bombarded with these stereotypes and just all kinds of ideologies. They're so pervasive. So, we definitely to some extent just like absorb them. And yeah, unless you really do some like intentional work to raise that critical sensitivity around it, you might not be so conscious of it. But I think like you both are used to thinking about these issues a lot in the work that you do in this podcast. So you're probably more aware of it than a lot of people.
I would hope most linguists are, but I know that's not necessarily the case.
Oh, yeah. Well, keep in mind that a lot of the people in my book were linguists, and they still would make these jokes. And I thought that was interesting too, that you can be a linguist and know all the stuff that we know about language and stereotypes and all of this and still reproduce them. So I think that even just shows even more like how insidious they are.
You're absolutely right. And I'm sure I know I've done it.
I think we all have. Yeah, we've all been guilty of like, language mocking or some kind of stereotyping at some point. Yeah, no one's perfect in that sense, I think.
Yeah, no. And what I was thinking about too is it was a Twitter thread about like how white people don't know how to do real talk, and I had never thought about it before. It was a Black woman, I think, and just her talking about how you can't, like, white people just don't know how to have these conversations, and so I think that's another thing that was like contributing to my like pit in my stomach, like the feeling in my stomach was like, oh yeah, I don't know how to have these conversations. This is like a thing. It's real.
Yeah.
So it's really great that you actually were able to have these conversations.
Yeah, it was difficult, but in the end, I hope it'll somehow be beneficial.
And you're all still friends still? All of you?
Yes, yes. Thankfully, yeah. It didn't have that detrimental of an effect on our relationships, thank goodness. So,
did anyone ever say, "Oh no, you can't record this conversation"?
Not that I remember. The only people that have not let me record them are my parents. Yeah, my mom has always had this blanket, like, don't record me policy. And then my dad, I'm like, one time he was open to it and I started recording, but maybe like a minute in or something. He was like, this is weird. Like, can we stop this? And I was like, sure. So I don't think, though, among my friends, I can't remember anyone, ever telling me not to record them. They were all pretty open to it and liked it, I would say. Actually, like, a lot of them were even more like, I think, performative. Like, a couple of my friends had like some improv comedy background and stand-up comedy background. And so I think they almost saw this as like an occasion to practice some of those skills.
I think a lot of people that don't do this kind of research wonder how you could possibly get authentic talk between people when there's recording happening. Do you think that there's a point where people just kind of forget and that's where you get the authentic stuff? Or what kind of, how does that play out?
Yeah, that's a good question. It always comes up, especially with my students, because I have them do this work too, recording conversations that they're a part of. And yeah, I generally tell them, they're always worried about this. And I usually say, after a while, the demands of the interaction are so much that people can't remember really that they're being recorded. So after 10 minutes or something, people usually forget. And then you might get that more naturalistic talk. And at the same time, like I said, I was recording these friends a lot. Like, this became a regular thing. So maybe to some extent, like, they became very used to it. And then, the flip side of that is, like, some people have actually analyzed how that observer's paradox is not necessarily a problem. This problem of where we observe language, how can it ever really be natural when we stick a recorder there? But like Cynthia Gordon has a paper on this and how you can actually look at moments where people orient to the recording device as moments for identity construction. And I saw that in my data. Like, some of the participants would say things like, let the record show, or, recorder, like they would talk to the device. So it's not even a problem per se when they do orient to it. You can also analyze that as something interesting in its own sake.
Well, and for you were a member of that group, that friend. So here, group meaning friend group. Yeah.
Yeah, that helps too. Yeah, right. That I had already been spending a lot of time with these people and we had those relationships. I wasn't like an outsider coming in doing this. Yeah. And, I guess I did have times where maybe people were like, let's stop this for a while. Like they wanted to gossip or something. And so it's like, let's pause this for a little bit and talk off the record, and then maybe we would turn it back on later. So that kind of stuff happened, but I don't think anyone was ever like, don't record me or don't use this. Yeah.
Can you walk us through some ways that we reference media in our language? Because I'm guessing almost all of us do this. I don't know. Can you say something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I definitely think probably, I think it'd be kind of weird if you didn't ever quote anything, right? Like, even if the type of media might vary, like some people don't play video games. Maybe they quote books or something. But yeah, I think it is something everyone does. So yeah, there's kind of two ways I think media comes up in our conversations. And one, I don't look at in this book. I'm kind of looking at this a little bit now in some newer work. But, you know, there's when we just mention like, oh, I saw this on TikTok, right? We're not quoting something from TikTok. We're just mentioning it. So that's one way, you know, you can reference media in your talk. And, you know, I'm kind of looking at that now among my students and conversations they've recorded. And it's kind of interesting because I think a lot of the ways they talk about media is actually very critical. They're very critical of it. So that's kind of interesting. And in my book, I just looked at literal, like kind of quotes, references, right, to media. So that's the other way that it comes up in our talk is quoting it. And even that can kind of look like two different ways. One is you quote something verbatim, right? Like you can directly quote like Game of Thrones and say like winter is coming, you know, and you can do the voice and the pitch shift and all that too if you want. So that's like a direct quote. But what I really had a lot of fun with is when people take something and they alter a piece of it to fit the current situation. So, for example, if y'all, being millennials, have seen the Disney Beauty and the Beast, I guess either one, they have the same song in it. And part of that song is like, it's about Belle. It's one of the introductory songs and like how weird she is.
Because she likes books and she's a brunette.
Yes. Yeah, basically. Because she's a nerd. So one of the lines is like, look, there she goes. That girl is so peculiar.
Yes.
And in my book, they used that in this one conversation to kind of playfully mock one of our friends for drinking, for making herself gin and tonic frequently. And they say like, oh, there she goes. She's drinking lots of liquor. So people would do that kind of thing, you know, where you take the melody or you take the original text, but you tweak a part of it and you apply that to the current situation. And those are probably, you know, some of the most fun examples.
I love it. I mean, my verbatim thing that I can think of right now is The Mandalorian. This is the way.
Uh-huh. I want to see the baby is the one I think about the most.
Oh, yes.
Or I would like to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess in Yoda, too, there is no try, there is only do. Or there are other, like, Star Wars ones, of course, because it's like a huge thing. So does that mean that, I guess it doesn't though, right? So it doesn't have to be a huge thing for people to pick up on it. Like it doesn't have to be a Star Wars. It could be a TikTok or, you know, whatever.
Yeah, it totally depends on the friend group or just who you're talking to. You know, there's some that are going to be more broadly known. Maybe some older texts too that kind of transcend like generational boundaries. So like in the conversations I recorded, people are quoting like Moby Dick and like Nietzsche at times. So those are like older, you know, long-standing texts. But it can be very niche. And it's almost like the more niche it is, the more fun and the more enjoyment you get when it's just you and that close friend, you know, who get the inside joke. So yeah, they can be very general or they can be super specific.
So I have a friend where, hi Adam, we talk about like NBA type stuff, but at a very specific period because we're the same age. And so like 1993 or whatever, when we were younger, these kind of references to that, is that a text too? Like, is that a way to reference media when it's sports? Like very specific?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that has come up with looking at my undergraduates conversations. Because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of their talk is about sports. And it's not something I personally know anything about or can relate to. But yeah, when I've had like some undergraduate research assistants coding this data, that has come up. Like, do we code these mentions of like sports players or sports games as, and I'm like, yeah, why not? Just capture everything, you know, and then we can get more specific later. But if it's something especially that you engaged with through media, like TV or radio, right, then it kind of makes sense.
Wait, so if people are saying don't be an asshole when they're referencing, like, on Twitter, like, in specific, that's, like, a thing?
That is a great intertextual catchphrase. Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, that's so, you know, linkable to your show, and it's almost like your slogan in a way. And
yeah,
no, it's really smart in a way. That's something I'm interested in, is almost like, how can people even intentionally create these kinds of like catchphrases that are likely to be repeated? And that one, I think, part of why it catches on is because it's very broadly applicable, right? Like, you can apply that to so many people and things that are said. So
yeah.
that was my intention. I was like, this does need to be something that we can apply to ourselves as well as anything.
Oh yeah, and like not be offended by it, like ourselves too. Like, if
Yeah.
So no, it's good.
No, it's true. It's, I've thought about it with like TV shows and all kinds of media. Like, why did these things catch on, And oftentimes they're kind of like, they're marked in some way. They're a little unusual. And oftentimes they're very broadly applicable. So you can easily map them onto a lot of different real life scenarios. So yeah, it's really interesting.
So let's talk about memes.
Yes,
because,
please.
I mean, basically that's a lot of what your book is about. So what are memes and what are internet memes?
Memes, can be understood really broadly as just any kind of idea that gets repeated. So that could be like fashion, for example, like when a fashion trend spreads, that could be a meme. Or it could be like an architectural style that comes into vogue, like Art Deco or something, brutalism. I don't know, that's like a meme that you see it and you like it and you repeat it. But usually, nowadays when we talk about memes, we're thinking of internet memes specifically. And I think, initially we probably thought of these mostly as like an image with text maybe, or maybe just text, something that spreads virally, right? That gets picked up and repeated on kind of a massive scale, and it carries some kind of cultural like meaning with it. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of how we're using memes nowadays and how I use it in my book.
Can a GIF or GIF be a meme?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. Yeah, I would say so. The lines can get kind of blurry in delineating these things. Like, actually, one of my graduate students asked me, why don't I just call everything in the book, all the media that gets repeated, meme references, right? Because if anything that gets repeated technically is a meme. So yeah, I think GIFs or GIFs, however you want to say it, yeah, that can definitely also count as a meme. And lately, I've been thinking about things like these emojis that are getting repeated. Like the chair emoji was this inside kind of joke on TikTok, standing in for laughter. So it's like, well, I guess that's a meme. I guess emojis can be memes now. And there's probably precedents before that. And now the red flag meme is happening. And that's, just repeating a bunch of red flags on Twitter or wherever. So yeah, it can be very broad, I guess. The concept is pretty flexible.
I've seen in media that people are using like meme or knowing what a meme is as some sort of generational age thing. But it sounds like memes have like always been a thing. So why are they using this as kind of like a shibboleth for being young? To know what it means.
Young, middle-aged, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think probably because they're thinking of it too narrowly. They are just thinking of internet memes. And yeah, maybe my dad, especially my grandmother, would have no idea, really what a meme is or how to describe it or define it. But again, if you talk about it on a broader scale, like fashion, right? Something that just gets replicated, then yeah, it's, it's really not that new of a concept of artistic style or something, right? Like Impressionism, for example. All of these are essentially examples of memes.
I think some people have the idea that a meme is a static image with Futura font on it. And
right. Yeah.
And I will say boomers use those just as much as anyone else, especially now.
Yeah.
And it leads perfectly into the next question, which is, why do we post memes online?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, why do we do anything online, right? Yeah, it's a good question. It's kind of philosophical in a way. I think like kind of essentially it's fun, it's fun, it's creative, it makes you feel like you're part of something bigger, part of this like community, that you get the joke, right? Or you get whatever's current. And usually like, if you're creating a meme, then there's really that creative component where you feel like, oh, I'm maybe like I'm smart, I'm witty, I'm cool, like you're really getting that benefit out of it. And then, you know, maybe you're getting likes or reposts or whatever. So you're getting that like internet street cred. You know, or if you're just sharing something someone else made, it can be part of the same process, I think. So I think fundamentally, like, it's just fun. And part of that is we like to feel like we're part of a community that like we share things, you know?
So speaking of, you know, like what some people think memes are, the static image, after the 2016 election, and I just stopped posting them altogether because they associated them so strongly with the alt-right.
Yeah.
Some of them, well, a lot of memes, did start in places like 4chan, and I've had some students interested in that. One of my graduate students wrote their dissertation on 4chan, and initially, I know. Initially, they were interested in memes, and then it turned into something different. But and actually, Whitney Phillips, she's one of my colleagues at Syracuse University. She's looked at this a lot, like how these spaces were where a lot of like meme culture came from, these like far right spaces, even though maybe at the time they weren't like called far right, but now that's what we've come to call them or see them as.
Well, so what they became maybe over time, because I don't think they started that way at all.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it really. Maybe you're right. I guess like one of my graduate students was telling me like in the early days, it wasn't seen as a place that was necessarily like a hateful or bigoted space, but it's become seen as that now. Now like people don't want to be associated with it at all. Like Whitney Phillips' work is interesting because it looks at how those spaces were very like generative and created all this like internet culture, but they were also like destructive, and that kind of ambivalence, and how the internet is really a place where that kind of ambivalence is sort of like fostered, and all the intricacies of that.
All right, let's talk about some of the particular memes that you talk about in your book. So
sure.
The strong independent Black woman meme, which I did not know. I was like, oh, this is a totally new one to me. But maybe you can explain it and explain like what the stereotypes are around it.
Sure. So I think that was one of the earliest ones I looked at in the light of stereotypes because it was so obvious. You know, like first I was just looking at everything under this, you know, either it was fun or it was filling that awkward space and doing that interactional work I talked about earlier of smoothing over like awkwardness and knowledge imbalances. So that one does function that way in the conversations I looked at. But speaking to the stereotypes within it, I think there's at least like 2 stereotypes in there. So the meme that the friends are referencing, it's like this image of a Black woman kind of wagging her finger, and then there's text that accompanies it, and it says something like, "I'm a strong, independent Black woman who don't need no man." So if you unpack this, it goes back to this kind of trope of like the sassy Black woman character in TV and film. So you have this Black woman being sassy. That's a stereotype and a trope right there. And then you have the linguistic stereotype of that, you know, the double negation, don't need no man, right? And that's African American English, but there's that stereotype there that all Black people speak this way, right? So there's those stereotypes. There's also like a even more maybe embedded ideology of like heteronormativity within that, right? That just women and men like paired together basically. So I guess there's like at least 3 different, you know, stereotypes that I can think of very quickly regarding that particular meme.
So I think that a lot of people that are not good linguists like we are will hear, or, you know, like see that this conversation's happening. Like we're talking about how there's stereotypes playing out in the way that they wrote the text, and think, why are you so obsessed with this? Why is this even important to note? I think we all as linguists who care about context and human beings that are creating the language care about this. How do you deal with that kind of idea that there are people out there who just don't understand why we keep pointing it out?
That's a really good question. Maybe I'm like in such a bubble that I don't even encounter that too much. Maybe like certain family members.
Yeah.
I mean, Yeah, maybe like, certain family members might come to mind that it takes some explaining and it can be frustrating. But yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's such like a circular problem, where it's like we as humans create media. We have these stereotypes and biases that we embed into the media, and then that media gets repeated and quoted. And it's just like this vicious cycle. So, and, I guess it all comes down to representation in a way, right? And the idea that representation matters. And that like the images we see and the text we read about people really inform the way we think about those people. And, that's important. And none of us are immune from that kind of almost, I guess you could call it like propaganda, or maybe like a lighter term, would be rhetoric or something. But none of us are immune to that. And, so I think it's important to be aware of how these things can shape just how we view other individuals and other groups, especially when you don't have any contact with those groups except through the media you're consuming. That's when I really see it being the most damaging is, people who have never actually had like a friend from Mexico, a close friend, all they see are these images of like Mexico on TV and in the news, and they form these like really, bad associations and opinions.
With this yellow, the sky's always yellow.
Yeah, the smog
Yeah.
or something. Like, what is that? I don't know. But I think this is why I hate any words associated with laziness. Probably because Mexico and Mexicans are very much portrayed as they're taking siestas again. Look at it, all of these things. Yeah, thank you. I'm just realizing now that this is like probably a media thing, because like I obviously
It is.
Oh, yeah.
I don't have any or my idea of Mexico luckily is also from family and just being there, so I have like something playing against it. But to think about the people that don't, it makes sense to think that siestas are like, I mean, why are they always napping?
Siestas are a good idea. We should all be doing it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a siesta, at least one every day.
Yeah.
I wish I was
but-
a better napper, but I'm not.
Yeah.
But I
No.
still think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's always like, when I think of certain people that are like bigoted in that way or racist, I always like realize they probably never met anyone from
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
Or maybe they never really formed like a relationship. Maybe
Yeah.
they like interacted,
Yeah,
but never
yeah.
had close relationships with people from these other cultures.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because I'm from small town BC, and let me tell you, every white person has met many First Nations people, and yet they have very stereotypical ideas about them because they never formed a close relationship. That's the key part.
So how are memes invoking stereotypes? Like, is it purposeful? Like, what is it doing as the user and as someone who is receiving the meme?
Yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily purposeful. Obviously, like, it can be. In my data, I don't think it ever really was. It's just, as we've been saying, like, this stuff is so embedded, and sometimes you wouldn't even notice it unless you really stare hard at it and pick it apart and think about it. And, it's just like any media, right? I think memes are a little worse. Like, when I was coding all of my data for stereotypes, memes were consistently the ones that, like, all of the memes had stereotypes.
Interesting.
And I think, my theory would be that's because they're, like, very contained, right? Like, it's like an image, it's text, it's just, like, one shot, and you have that one shot to make your point. Whereas, like, in a TV show or something or a movie, you have time to like explore the stereotype. Maybe you end up subverting it somehow and getting like a different message across. But with a meme, there's no time for that. It's just an effective way to get a message across, just stereotype, some group of people or some package up some kind of ideology that everyone will recognize and just go with. And of course, a lot of those can be traced back to older forms of media. And then like, as for, the effect they have, I just think, like I said, a lot of times people aren't doing it intentionally. They're making the references for these other interactional purposes that they serve. But I do think, especially in certain spaces, like white spaces where racial stereotypes are being repeated, it just reinforces that idea of otherness, and that like, oh, well, like we're not Black women or Black people. And like, we don't speak that way. It just kind of like reinforces that. And it also reinforces the norms within the group. And whatever that behavior is. So I think that's kind of like the effect. It's sort of this Jane Hill talks about like covert racism, I think. And it's just another form of covert racism where it kind of goes under the radar and it's kind of more subtle, but it is a form of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there is it a way to use memes that's not like upholding stereotypes? Like, should we just stop? I mean, I'm mostly meaning the maybe the textual ones, because I do think everything is a meme, and so not everything is obviously racial, like brutalism, whatever. But like these types of memes, should we just stop using them?
It's a good question. I think, we should be more conscious of the ones we're using if and when possible to be so. There's probably some that like don't have stereotypes, like when we're talking about like the chair emoji or whatever, right? I can't really think of a stereotype in that. There's some that are, much more obvious, like the strong black woman meme, like that one. Pretty much anyone, if you show that to, and if they look at it for a while, they're going to start, and you ask them, a couple basic questions, they're going to be like, okay, yeah, there's something wrong with this meme. So some of them are more obvious like that. And then, some people try to like intentionally do memes that are subverting stereotypes, like especially gender stereotypes, which are super prevalent. And actually that was probably the one that's most prevalent in just gender stereotyping and ideologies of heteronormativity and how men and women behave. So sometimes people try to subvert those in their memes. So I guess that's another thing you can look for. But overall, I think it's just a matter of trying to become a little more conscientious of this and a little more aware of it. And yeah, just don't be an asshole, I guess.
Absolutely. Yes. It's the idea of being a conscientious consumer of media, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I have noticed the shift in myself when I watch TV or whatever now, that I try to be a conscientious consumer. I think some people think that it's going to make that media not as fun, but I don't think that's true. And of course, some of the media is actually like, harmful. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to watch this anymore because they're playing into the stereotype in a very disgusting way, or, that kind of stuff. But like for the most part, it just makes me feel like a more thoughtful person. I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
Yeah, it's like you can just appreciate the different layers, of like you can enjoy something and also be critical of it. No problem. Like I do it all the time,
Absolutely.
Even Squid Game, I'm thinking about, racial stereotypes, and maybe they could have written the women characters a little bit better and different things, but it's like I still enjoy it overall and, recommend that show. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm not done it yet, so no spoilers.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm probably going to do it tonight because SNL did this country song parody about it with Pete Davidson and Rami Malek.
You were missing it. Yeah, you're missing the intertextual
yeah, and I was
humor there.
I was like, okay, this is just funny because I like Pete Davidson as a country singer right now, but I need to understand what Squid Game references are happening here. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
That was a really great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything, like one last message you want to leave with our listeners?
Well, one thing, that I did want to say about my friends and just recording them, I'm just so grateful to them that they let me record them, that they were part of the study, even when we get into all these critical issues that we've discussed on this show. I just wanted to give them a big shout out, and it really made me appreciate them a lot more, like their intellects, their sense of humor, how they were able to make these intertextual connections so quickly. And, we have artwork from one of the participants actually on the cover. She had created this mural of the housemates in my study as video game characters. Before I even did my study, like that mural was a thing. So it was just perfect for the cover art, and I'm so glad she let us use it. And another friend in the book was a photographer and took the picture. So I kind of just want to give them all a big shout out. And then for the listeners, if you're interested, the book is out November 9th, fingers crossed, pending any, Suez Canal blockages or whatever else might happen. And then we have some social media accounts that my undergraduate RAs have been awesome in helping me run. So we're on Instagram, Twitter, and even TikTok. So if you just search like Millennials Talking Media on any of those platforms, we'll come up if people want to see what we're posting and have some fun with us.
Cool. Yeah, because ultimately it's important. It's also fun.
Yeah.
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 That's true.
Yeah. I mean, we try to, it's a mix of, having fun with media and, like we said, being critical of it at the same time. So, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I'm sorry that I'm just like, hey, is this a meme? Is this a meme? Is this a meme,
great.
Sylvia?
Oh, you came up with great examples. So.
Well, we leave our listeners with one final meme. Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
This month, we would like to thank Mandy Carson for becoming a patron.
Yay!
And anyone who would like to join us can do so at www.patreon.com/vocalfriespod. And we have mugs, and we have bonus episodes, and we have stickers.
Yes, and our bonus episode for December is really exciing. So,
oh, yeah.
yes.
That is true.
Yes.
We have one coming up.
Yep.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.